Hello, my dear students. Welcome to yet another class of Structuralism. Today, we are starting with Structuralist Narratology, the relationship between narrative and structuralism. When Shaw started his theories regarding language, sign, signifier, signified, it was extended to other streams also. And here you can see various other theorists. We are connecting narratives with the structuralism. Today we will be dealing with Greimas. We have already dealt with Roland Barthes and his 5 codes. Today we will be dealing with Greimas, and later on we will proceed with other theorists. Welcome to the class. A narrative or story or tale is any account of a series of related events or experiences. It can be non-fictional like memoir, biography, news report, documentary, travelogue, or the narrative can be fictional like fairy tale, novel, fables, like that. And narratives can be presented through a series of written or spoken words, moving images, or combination of written or spoken words. Narrative is a particular form of representation implementing signs, says Paul Cobley in his work Narrative. We are going to study about narratology, structuralist narratology. Narratology is the science of narrative. What is a narrative? Narrative is a system of signs. Signs. What are signs? Sounds, words, gestures are all signs. Everything is a sign, which is a signifier too. A narrative is a system of signs in a particular sequence or order. It is the semiotic representation, semiotics, signs, study of signs. So it is the representation of signs. It is the representation of events through signs that is meaningfully connected in a temporal and causal way. The events are connected according to time, and one event can be the cause of another event. That is why it has been said. It is the semiotic representation, that is the representation of signs, or events are represented through signs. It is the semiotic representation of a series of events, and that is connected meaningfully in a temporal and causal way. Today, narratology studies the narrative aspects of many literary and non-literary genres. That includes lyrical poems, films, drama, history, advertisements, etc. Narrative is the act of representation using signs in particular sequences. Act of representation something using signs. Signs we saw, it can be words, sounds, or gestures. So it comes to literature, it is the act of representation in poem or novel using signs, using different types of words in particular sequences, so that we construct specific notions of reality, and we construct specific notions of self through narrative. We construct specific notions of the world through narrative. Narrative is the construction and interpretation of the world. How do we do that? Using words, sounds, figures, gestures, and relation. It has been said that by Paul Weig, a theorist, narrative as the ways in which we construct notions of history, we construct notions of politics, race, religion, identity, and all these things, history, politics, race, religion, it can be understood as stories, right? History we understand as stories, and or event in politics we understand it as stories or an event. And these things construct the ways in which the world is experienced, and we experience world through all these things. We as a person experience the world through all these narratives. So we can define narrative as it is the act of representation using signs and particular sequences so that we construct specific notions of reality. It is also the construction and interpretation of the world through the use of words, sounds, figures. Narrative is linked to language because in language we have signs, and narrative is linked to language. Study of narrative is called narratology. Study of narrative is called narratology. This term often used interchangeably with poetics. And there is another term called discourse, which is used to describe the language of narrative. The language of narrative, the way it is written, discourse. Earlier or traditionally, discourse meant spoken or written presentation. Everything we have in front, spoken or written, it is a discourse. It is what? Discourse is what we read, or discourse is what we listen to. Narratology in literary theory is a study of narrative structure. Narratology, the study of narrative structure in the literary theory. That is how a narrative can be divided into its constituent elements. Narratology looks at what narratives have in common, how Claude Lévi-Strauss analyzed myths, what myths have in common. They have a same underlying structure. He found that. So in narratology also, the theorists are looking into what narratives have in common and what makes one different from another. Like structuralism and semiotics, from the narratology is derived, it is based on the idea of a common literary language or a universal pattern of codes that operate within the text of a work. Roland Barthes, we have seen 5 different codes when he analyzed a narrative. Remember, proaeretic, hermeneutic, symbolic, semantic, cultural code. So narratology is based on the universal pattern of codes that operate in all narratives. And the narratives can be found and communicated through a wide variety of media. Oral form or written form, stories, movies, drama, anything. Same narrative can be seen in different forms. So to begin with, there are 2 ways at looking at narratology. A wider definition that draws from Aristotle's Poetics that anything that has a plot is a narrative. Anything that has a plot is a narrative. And a narrow definition is that anything that has a plot with a narrator is narrative. Any work that has a plot but with a narrator is a narrative. And a narrative, there is mediated enunciation. That in any work or in any narrative, if there is someone as a narrator who is speaking about what is happening, who is enunciating what is happening, that is mediated enunciation in novels or short stories or movies. These are mediated enunciations. Drama, the live theatrical play, what we see now, is immediate and there is no narrator now. Earlier, chorus, prologue, and all there, so it was mediated, we can say. But drama, which has no narrator, the characters are just acting in a live stage, it is unmediated enunciation. The novelistic tradition requires its own specific narrative analysis. The novels, it has its own specific narrative analysis. And we will elaborate this various analysis in our coming sections, coming slides. The foundations of narratology were laid from Vladimir Propp's Morphology of the Folktale, which was published in 1928, that created a model for folktales, and it was based on 7 spheres of action and 31 functions of narrative. And in Claude Lévi-Strauss, also in his work Structural Anthropology, he outlined a grammar of mythology. We have seen that. It was also a foundational work of narratology. A.J. Greimas in 1966, through his work Structural Semantics, he proposed a system of 6 structural units called actants. And in Thodorov's The Grammar of Decameron, he introduced the term narratology. All these theorists were adapting the structuralist idea, that is, analyzing a narrative. They divided the structure, they understood the structure of narrative. In Figures 3rd in 1972, and Narrative Discourse Revisited, Gerard Genette codified a system of analysis, examined actual narration and the act of narrating. Other influential theorists in narratology were Roland Barthes, we have seen his structuralist narrative, then Claude Bremond, Gerald Prince, Seymour Chapman, and Meg Ball. Narratology is the study of narrative and narrative structure and how this narrative affect human perception. Narratology is an anglicization of French narratology, which is coined by Todorov in the work The Grammar of the Decameron. It was in 1969. And the theoretical influence is traceable to Aristotle's Poetics. I told you earlier the wider definition that any narrative has a plot. A work that contains plot is a narrative from Aristotle, the definition from Aristotle. But modern narratology is agreed to have begun with the Russian formalist. The major practitioners were Vladimir Propp, through his Morphology of Folktale, Mikhail Bakhtin, from his theories of heteroglossia, dialogism, and chronotop, which was presented in the Dialogic Imagination. Structuralist, the above mentioned structuralist, seeks to understand how recurrent elements were recurring, those elements, themes and patterns in a narrative yield a set of universals a universal pattern of these elements, themes that determine the makeup of a story. So, underlying elements and themes were same. The ultimate goal of such analysis is to move from a classification of elements. Structuralists were moving from the classification of elements to an understanding of how these elements, how these themes are arranged in actual narratives. How these elements are arranged in actual narratives, whether it is fictional or non-fictional. Like structuralists were trying to find out how a word gets its meaning. Same way, structuralist narratologists were also looking into how these elements were arranged in actual narratives. And the tradition out of which narratology began with the linguistic work of Saussure, and by distinguishing between parole and langue, that is the system, the overall system, Saussure initiated structuralism. We have seen all those things, and keep in mind the structuralist narratology is also based on these things. Roman Jakobson and Russian formalists also influenced the study of narrative, revealing how literary language differs from ordinary language. There are certain elements, there are certain themes, there are certain patterns, and they were into the understanding how literary language differs from ordinary language. Structuralism was further shaped by French anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss. We have seen it, who concluded that myths found in various cultures can be interpreted in terms of their repetitive structures. All myths have the same underlying structures. We have seen that too. Espoused by Zvezdan Todorov and Roland Barthes, illustrates how a story's meaning develops from its overall structure. From the overall structure of narrative, how a story's meaning develops. There is an underlying structure for all narratives that we saw in the Claude Lévi-Strauss analysis of myth. There is an underlying structure, a common structure. Same way, there is a common structure in all narratives too. And how a story's meaning develops from its overall structure rather than from each individual story's isolated theme. So, langue, that is the common structure, parole, that is the individual story's theme. According to Aristotle, all narratives develop longitudinally, that there is a beginning to a story, then other events happen, and then there is an end to the story. And all the events are connected meaningfully, and they are connected, they are acting in temporal and causal way. This means that narratives can be analyzed horizontally at what Barthes calls the syntagmatic level, one after the other syntagmatic level. But narratives are also complex representations of events and whose meaning requires interpretation. You remember when we analyzed Barthes' structuralist narratology, he was into 5 different codes, 5 different ways to take the meaning out of the narrative. Narratives are complex representations of events, and the meaning of these events requires certain interpretations. And the complexity of meanings calls for a vertical analysis, and you can analyze it vertically. The story can be analyzed vertically, or in the paradigmatic way, or the hermeneutic analysis. Drawing on Saussurean linguistics, langue, parole, French structuralists define literature as a kind of langue. Literature is a whole structure wherein each specific work, that can be novel, drama, poetry, that is an instance of parole. Roland Barthes, Claude Bremond, A.J. Greimas, Todorov chose to develop an underlying structure approach to literature. Consequently, the main aim of their structural activity, the main aim of these structuralists, was to identify the general codes. We saw how Roland Barthes identified certain codes. So, aim of the structuralist was to identify the general code that structure literary language as a whole. These general codes would structure literary language as a whole. There would be a definite codes in that literary structure, and these theorists try to identify the general codes. In this abstract type of approach, the individual work is relevant only as the concrete materialization. Each individual work, that is parole, identified as parole, is relevant only as the materialization of the general codes. General code, it can be long, it would be the long general codes, and each individual work is the materialization of the general code. On the contrary, the surface structure of the discourse approach to narrative pays attention to the analysis of the functioning of individual works as long in their own right. This approach is dominated by the work of Gerard Genette that we will look into later. Broad analysis we will look later when we analyze Gerard Genette and his contribution to structuralist narratology. Vladimir Propp, Viktor Shklovsky, Todorov, they explored narrative structure in fiction. Vladimir Propp's analysis of the folktale in Morphology of the Folktales, his analysis is an example of structuralist criticism at work. He argued that every character in a folktale's plot had a specific function. Propp analyzed 7 key performers that create 7 spheres of action, 7 different characters who generate the entire plot, 7 spheres of action, 7 key performers that create 7 spheres of action, and it is constant in all the folktales. For one thing, researchers have found that certain underlying narrative structures remain constant, despite apparently diversity of story would be there, diversity of content and form would be there, but the underlying narrative structures remain the constant. Underlying structure would be same. When Vladimir Propp studied 100 Russian folk tales, he found that same types of actions were being performed. In all the folk tales, in the 100 folk tales, same types of actions were being performed. The hero is transported to another kingdom, but the characters and details were changed. They varied greatly. For example, just imagine the story of Cinderella. In all the fairy tales, you can see there would be the meek and gentle princess and evil nature of stepmom, and prince would come and save the princess. That is common, but the circumstances would be different in another tale. But characters and their imminent qualities would remain same. So that's what he's saying. The underlying structure would be same. The 7 key performers he analyzed, and that remains constant in all the folk tales. Propp identified 7 spheres of action and 31 fixed elements that fit his sample of stories when he studied 100 stories. And though tales from other cultures reveal additional elements, there are additional elements in other tales also, but they are also composed of the same recurring patterns. Fairy tales can be reduced to a set of 7 characters who generate entire plot through their various relationships. When analyzing a narrative, According to Propp, he was dealing with folk tales. He reduced the whole tale into a set of 7 characters. Through these 7 characters, he could generate the entire plot. According to Propp, there would be hero, a false hero, villain, donor or provider, helper, princess and her father, and a dispatcher. Structural analysis then shows the basic social psychological task that people confront during their lives. Structural analysis shows the issues of dependence, interdependence, selfishness or sacrifice, birth or death. Structural analysis, through their narrative structure, shows the basic socio-psychological task that the people face in their daily lives. Propp also identified 31 functions to be found in every folktale. There are absentation, interdiction, violation, reconnaissance, delivery, trickery, complicity, villainy and lack, mediation, counteraction, departure, first function of donor, hero's reaction, receipt of magic agent, spatial transference, struggle, branding, victory, liquidation, return, pursuit, rescue, unrecognized, unfounded claims, difficult task, solution, recognition, exposure, transfiguration, punishment, wedding. These functions are common in all the folktale. Folktale is reducible to this set of functions created by the 7 performers, that hero, villain, false hero, donor, helper, princess and her father, dispatcher. The set of functions created by these 7 performers. Number of spheres of action is finite, but characters are infinite. Whatever be the number of characters, they all combine in specific ways to generate the plot. You can reduce a folktale into these set of functions created by the 7 performers. In every folktale, it is reducible to this set of functions, to the set of 31 functions, which are created by the 7 performers. Study of narrative was facilitated by structuralism. Structuralism systematized study of plot. They also systematized study of character, symbol, and provided a formula for narratives, that every narrative acts on certain formulas, or there is a common formula for all narratives. A.G. Greimas, he was one of the earliest practitioners of structuralist narratology. He, through his work Structural Semantics, it was published in 1966, and through his work he developed an idea called structural semiotics, and the idea was built upon Saussures' binary oppositions. Greimas paid close attention to the way in which opposition help us organize meaning. He suggested that there are semantic units that work in opposition. There are meaningful units that work in opposition. What is light, which is not dark, that is light. Who is a male, which is not a female, that is a male. So he suggested that the meaningful units, semantic units, work in opposition. He termed these semantic units as semis and argued that meaning emerges in the contrast between semis. Meaning comes out from the contrast between these semantic units. Some common semis or semantic units would be light or dark, up and down, or male or female. So the binary opposition is the primary structure of all meaning. All words functions in a Binary opposition. Binary opposition is the primary structure of all meaning production. How a meaning is produced because of the binary opposition as per structuralist. It is possible that we see paired opposites as positive and negative, where one element is the negative component of their pair. Like dark is the negative of light, female as the negative of male. So in the binary opposition, one word gets more important. Greimas suggested that these semis work as actants to generate narrative. These semis, these semantic units like light, dark, like up, down, male, female, or whatever be the semantic units, work as actants. He called the words as actants, which generate narrative. Greimas was proposing a Saussurian notion. What was his Saussurian notion? What was the Saussurian notion behind that? How the meaning was formed? The meaning was formed as the opposition between words. Meaning emerges in the difference. Meaning emerges from the opposition between words. We work with binary oppositions to make sense of words. Like that, he was also working with semis. It worked as actants to generate narrative. Meaning emerged with opposition between words. Same way, semis work as actants to generate narrative. Semis form the basic formula, the rules and the underlying structure of language. Semis express themselves. They manifest as narratives and plots and stories. These semantic units, these words, these actants manifest as narratives and plots and stories in context. The semis in various combinations, these semantic units in various combinations are enunciated in particular context to produce stories. These semis are common in all narratives as per Greimas. He evolved a set of 6 actants, that is, set of semis or binary oppositions. 6 actants, which is a set of semis or binary oppositions that provide grammar and rules for all narratives. The set of 6 actants, that is subject or object, sender or receiver, helper or opponent. These are the 6 actants, that is set of binary oppositions. Subject, object, sender, receiver, helper, opponent. These are the actants who perform specific functions in all narratives. What are the specific functions of these actants? Desire, search, aim, communication, and support or hindrance. These are the actants, subject or object, sender or receiver, helper or opponent. They perform specific functions in all narratives. First one is desire, search or aim. Subject has a certain aim and desire directed at a particular goal or object. That is common in all narratives. Specific function, a desire or search or aim. And the subject would have a certain aim. Communication, that second function. Subject is sent out on his or her mission by a sender who facilitates the mission and will reward the subject. Receiver is one who rewards. That is the communication. The function is communication. Subject is sent out for a mission. And a reward would be there for the subject. And the receiver is the one who rewards. These are all common in all narratives. There is auxiliary support or hindrances as another specific function. That is, subject is helped in a quest and mission by the helper, and it is obstructed by the opponent. So these are the specific functions in all narratives, and these functions are performed by the actants. The 6 actants, that is the set of semis or binary oppositions. According to Greimas, a formula for the narrative can there be like this. The formula for all the narratives would be like this, that all narrative will be following these things. That is, first one is contract or prohibition, where the subject is sent out on a quest or mission. The subject is there with a quest, or subject is there for a mission, and if the subject accepts that contract, we can say it is the establishment of contract in the narrative if the subject accepts that mission. Or if the subject declines or disobeys that mission, we can say it is the violation of contract in the narrative. See, this acceptance of contract or establishment of contract or violation of contract, or the subject, object, auxiliary, support, these are all things common in all narratives. Remember Claude Lévi-Strauss understood myth. What he said, all myths have following a same underlying pattern. Same like Greimas is also finding out that all narrative has a same underlying structural pattern. If you analyze a narrative, you can identify all these elements. And if the subject accepts the contract, we can say we have rewards in the narrative. And if the subject violates the contract, we can say it is the punishments would be there in the narrative. The whole processes, we can say, can be read under 3 main structures that are common to all narrative as per Greimas, that is contractual structures, performative structures, and disjunctive structures. And what do you mean by contractual structures? Here, the hero is given a task by sender, sent on a particular mission, seeks an object. That is how the contractual structures launch the plot. The first thing, the hero is given a task, and hero is on a particular mission. Hero is going to seek the object, and the contract is there now. Establishment of contract is there, and this contractual structures actually launch the plot. See, ഒരു നമ്മൾ ബാഹുബലിയുടെ കേസ് എടുത്ത് നോക്കിയാൽ മതി. The first part, hero is given a task that to bring Devasena back, Devasena to release Devasena from the clutches of the other character. But you remember, you try to connect with that, so it would be easy for you to understand. Hero is given a task by sender. It is on the particular mission to release Devasena, and then the establishment of contract that happens. Okay, then that contractual structure actually launches the plot. Second one is performative structures. That is, the subject undertakes the task, the battles, obstacles, and the helper would be there, and opponent would be there to thwart that things. Okay, and it also, the subject is faced with trials, tribulations, and the whole important sequences that are happening. The performative structure, the correct actions that are taking place. This is the action of in the narrative, performative structures. Next comes the disjunctive structures. That is, these are not really connected with the performative structures or contractual structures, or we can say the actual plot. This will not be, this stays something apart, or stays aloof from the main plot. That is, these can be the moments of arrival, or the moments of departure, or the moments in the narrative when the subject leaves the place or home, arrives at a particular place. These are the disjunctive structures, which is really different from the correct action in the narrative. These are also interludes in the narratives, where the scene for the next action is set. So Greimas in Structural Semantics developed a model of narrative by positing actants as fundamental structural units. So what are the actants?
the six actants, that is paired as binary opposites: subject or object, sender receiver, helper opponent. Subject is paired with the object he seeks, then object is sought by the subject, that is the first binary opposition. Then the second one is sender or the receiver. Sender sends the subject and the receiver of the object to be secured by the subject. And the third one is helper or opponent, helper of the subject, and there would be definitely an opponent who thwarts all the actions of the subject, or will try to thwart the actions of the subject. So these are the binary opposites. These six actants can be seen in all the narratives as per the theorist. A narrative, you remember, anything has a plot with a narrative, or any work that has a plot is narrative, or any work that has a that has plot with a narrator is a narrative. So these things keep in mind. These binary opposites of six actants is common to all narratives. And these actants describe and carry out three basic patterns in any narrative. What are the major actions? Desire, search, aim, communication, auxiliary support, or hindrance. And Greimas does things in terms of the relations between the elements, relation between all these elements. See the relationships between the words and how they acquire the meaning. Remember, so sure. Same like Greimas also thinks in terms of the relations between the elements and how they get the meaning. The narrative thus follows this framework. A contract is established between the sender and subject to bring about a new order, or reinstall peace, or discover or seek something. Subject who becomes competent along with the access of desire, duty, obligation, and knowledge goes on the quest, and as a result of her or his actions restore order or brings in a new one, for which he or she is duly rewarded or punished. Just think about Bahubali and how you can remember all these elements: the subject, the object, then actions are taking place, and it is subject is sent out by the sender to bring about a new order, then with the help of helper, and there is an opponent also, and in the end you can see actions are by the action of the subject everything is restored, and rewards he or she is getting, and the opponents get punished. So remember all these things in terms of your an example of your work, like I say said of Bahubali. You just remember all these things so you can connect it easily and you can memorize it easily. So that's it for Greimas, structural semantics, and we will continue with the structuralist narratology in our next class. Happy learning.